Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Eliana Ramirez. I am delighted and honored to be here with Mr. Mahir Nisar, who is an employment attorney and, frankly, a bit of a celebrity on LinkedIn in the world of workplace abuse and bullying. Mr. Nisar, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to talking about this.
As many people who've been following me for a while will know that I am a fan of these videos that you've put out on TikTok and then also on LinkedIn. We were just chatting before the recording started about these really insightful videos, and several of them are in vehicles as you're kind of traveling to different places. But I understand you've also done some of them in an office.
Yes, right here. Yeah.
Right here. Okay.
Office. Yeah, absolutely. I like sometimes I'm just on the go and I want to have a quick video in between going from one place to the other to talk about workplace rights and experiences that people go through within the workplace. And sometimes I just get my best ideas in the car. I don't know why.
Well, I'm thrilled that you have places that you need to travel to so that we can, have the benefit of that. I just want to take a moment and welcome anyone who has logged on. If you want to introduce yourselves in the comments, in the chat, we would love to know who's joining us and welcome you. Throughout the course of this interview, if you have questions that come up, please do put them in the chat and we will get to them as we are able. I know that, Mr. Nisar, I had encouraged Mr. Nisar to go ahead and let me know if any of the questions that we might ask are beyond what he is able to speak about as an attorney. And so we'll just acknowledge and welcome that boundary, whatever boundaries that you might have for us. But we do welcome people to put questions in the chat. And for folks who might be watching this recording after the event, welcome to you as well. I know some people on LinkedIn are very interested in the information that we're about to discuss, which is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and LGBTQ+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, identified, employee workforce self-defense. Many people are interested in this information, but frankly are not going to log on while the actual recording is going because they're concerned that they might be watched by people that they work with. So just want to shout out and acknowledge for everyone that there are many different considerations for people who are interested in the information you're about to share and how they're going to keep themselves safe. So we'll just go ahead and jump in to the first question is, if you would just kind of share with me a little bit about the types of behavior or treatment that violate employment anti-discrimination laws regarding race, ethnicity, and LGBT identities.
Yeah, there are so many different patterns of behavior that someone can experience within the workplace. The first step is really understanding that, as somebody from the BIPOC, LGBTQ+ community, you have a right to be treated fairly within the workplace. You're entitled to an equal opportunity. These are really hard fought off laws that have been created as a result of sacrifices from people that have spoken up in circumstances where they were denied an equal opportunity to exist freely and to have an opportunity to grow and have success. So these rights are not to be taken for granted. These are privileges that have been earned, and they are something that you have inherently received. And it's important that when you start to notice, based upon your status, that you don't feel like you're being given a fair shot, it's important to understand what are the ways that you can hold it accountable. Now, oftentimes recognizing and identifying the behaviors, it can be a multitude of things, right? There could be scenarios where you start to recognize that someone doesn't want to talk to you, right? Communication is always a major factor in how you experience your work environment. When you are not really being spoken to, when you're not being invited to different events, when you're not being included, when you start to notice that whenever you pass by, nobody's saying hello, they're not greeting you, they're not including you in conversations that they're having, they're in a clique, they're talking to each other, but every time you pass by, they go silent. You go through these patterns enough throughout the workday, and then during the week, over time, you start to feel as if maybe they don't like me. What is it about me? What is it that they don't like? And so oftentimes we start to now doubt ourselves and whether or not our existence is a problem for them, right? Because they don't want everything to do with you. And those indicators really start with communication. So I think identifying and seeing whether or not the communication is not as it should be. And so once you recognize that, then you have to identify like why. What is the motivating factor behind not being communicated with, not being included, being isolated? These are just the beginning steps. The next steps are usually when you start to recognize that you're being treated differently in a way that it's impacting your career progression. Oftentimes you're not going to have a scenario, and it's going to be rather rare that they're going to say something right out to you and say, you know what, I don't like you because of this. It's going to be rare that they're going to do that. But they may do what we call microaggressions. They may say certain things that will give you an insight into their mindset and that underlying prejudice. And that should give you a good indication that, hey, something doesn't smell right here. It doesn't feel right. I'm experiencing it. Now, in that moment, don't question yourself. A lot of people audit themselves and their experiences because they feel as if they may have contributed to how other people are treating them. That's not how it goes. You have a right to be treated fairly within that work environment and to be given an equal opportunity. If there are personality issues, if there are issues in terms of, behaviors that perhaps they don't like of yours, you have to communicate about it, right? They have to talk to you about it. But if they don't even want to talk to you, that should be a strong indicator that they don't really want you there. So I think in that circumstance, you need to start to hold it accountable. And we'll talk a little bit about what mechanisms I usually advocate for when you start to notice, these things happen.
I really appreciate you sharing that there are some subtle indicators that will start in the very beginning and that we need to listen to and be aware of how we feel in our body. You talked about like something smells off or something feels off. Oftentimes with those subtleties, it is our body that's going to let us know that, oh, something's not right here. As we start to walk into the office, if we happen to work in an office in the morning and our heart starts pounding, or we start to feel nauseous, or we're having a hard time sleeping, it's oftentimes our body that's going to tell us in one way or another that something is off, that it is an abusive environment. It might be a hostile environment, which I understand is a legal term in particular. But I'm just kind of stepping back for a moment and imagining people who are logging in. I failed to share where you practice law. I wonder if we could go back to that for a moment, if you'd share, please.
Yeah, of course. My name is Mahir Nisar. I am an employment attorney. I represent clients here in New York, New Jersey. We have attorneys that practice in other states such as Ohio, North Carolina, Washington, D.C., and we co-counsel with a lot of different attorneys in different states, depending on the specific claim. So we primarily focus on employment discrimination. My objective, a lot of through my social media content, is to empower individuals. So that way you don't need a lawyer, right? I want to go out of business. I want to be done with this work. I do this because I recognize that there is a very clear lack of attorneys that actually understand these experiences and these patterns to hold it accountable, right? This is not about money. This is about accountability. This is about obtaining justice when people have been harmed. So a lot of the content that you'll find on my social media is going to be about empowering yourself, making sure that you're able to get the mental health treatment that you need when you're going through these things, and have clarity on the next steps so that way you can continue to fulfill a meaningful journey in your career.
I'm so grateful that you shared that. It reminds me, for many BIPOC and LGBTQ people, by the time that we end up in a work environment that involves discrimination, it's oftentimes not the first time we've experienced discrimination. It oftentimes starts early in our lives, where, whether we're on the schoolyard or later on, if we go through higher education, we're having constant experiences with interpersonal and systemic racism and or anti-LGBT bias. And so by the time that we're in our career and we're experiencing that discrimination in the workplace, it can really activate some old and pre-existing racial stressors or even traumas that can make it more difficult to ascertain or to identify that what's happening around us really is problematic, because we kind of have grown up to expect that we will experience racism or anti-LGBT bias. And many of us, because of intergenerational racial trauma that our parents or grandparents might have experienced as well, we might be given the message of, ay, mija, or that means like my daughter in Spanish, ay, mija, this is a good employer. You've got good benefits. Why would you walk away from that? And don't mess it up. And as you're saying, knowing a little bit about these laws that have been hard fought are so important, because many of us weren't told what our rights were. So you started talking about kind of those subtle messaging that you're not accepted, you're different, people are not providing you the information necessary to do your job, might be withholding some resources or even just access to meetings or social engagements where business deals happen. What are kind of the next level of behaviors or lack of behavior that you see as the situation starts to escalate further?
Yeah, I mean, I think once the communication stalls and you start to notice that, they're not really communicating with me enough, you start to question yourself. You start to think that maybe you need to work harder to be seen, to be heard, that you need to be more, you need to be a bit more aggressive and assertive with trying to be seen. And then oftentimes in those moments, then, when you're doing that, then they start to push you off. And then, and then in those moments, you feel like you don't know what to do. And oftentimes it's that uneasiness of not understanding, what can you do to make it right? And oftentimes people are trying to find a way to be seen and heard in their work environment, to be given that equal opportunity by trying to work through it, to try to find a way, because we all try to figure out, like, okay, how can I fix this? How can I fix this? And when we're trying to fix something that's not within your control, it is very difficult for us to not experience the mental health impact of that. Because at the end of the day, when somebody's in a, let's say, supervisory role, a management role, and they have supervisory power over you, those power dynamics plays a big role in how you feel and how you experience that environment. And when you're being denied opportunities there, and they're not really trying to work with you through trying to figure things out, it is very difficult to deal with. And I oftentimes think at that time, having somebody that works in the mental health space to work with you to gain clarity about what's happening, to kind of have those professional conversations with a professional to kind of work through it is going to be essential. Because, one of the things you mentioned is about, like, people that have experienced this growing up, right? There's a lot of experiences that you will have growing up. You will have generational trauma that may be passed down to you. You may have experiences of your own that you carry with you. And so oftentimes we need to try to find ways to heal from these wounds. And we need to sometimes even look at the behaviors and habits that we have nurtured in our life in order to protect ourselves. Because sometimes we're out to protect ourselves, and sometimes some people may even become hypervigilant, which is also a somewhat of a survival mechanism, because we want to be treated fairly, we want to be seen, we want to be given a fair opportunity. And in these situations, there are just so many different ways that your bodies will react. I had a podcast a while back with a workplace bullying expert out of Canada. She's on LinkedIn as well, and she's phenomenal. And one of the first indicators that people experience when they're going through these difficult circumstances within the workplace is that it impacts their sleep. So the first indicator is that you're not going to be sleeping well. And once you start to not sleep well, you're not recovering well. Sleep is restorative, right? It restores you. You're not restoring your health. You're just depleting everything that's within you, and it's not healthy. And that's when other illnesses start to creep up. So I think it's important that, we understand that there are going to be circumstances in which the behaviors and patterns of experiencing not only discrimination, but abuse and exploitation and misbehavior that does happen is not something to do with you. It's not because of you. It is not having anything to do with what you can do to fix it. It's not in your control, but it is in your control to hold it accountable. Holding it accountable is understanding, okay, this isn't fair. This isn't right. I have a right to be treated in a better way than this. That person that's, white is getting a better treatment. They're being spoken to. They're being invited. They're having these closed door meetings and they're laughing, and I see it through the window. They're going out for coffee. They're going out for a drink. I'm not included in emails. I find out later that the email didn't even include me, and I'm on that project. These type of patterns are indicative, and oftentimes these things can hurt us, and so we start to personalize it. But the most important thing to really remember, it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with them and their mindset. And holding that mindset accountable is what it's all about. And that's what the law essentially looks at. It looks at the motivating factor. It looks at what motivates their mindset to treat someone in this particular way. And then when you start to recognize those patterns, I always advocate for developing paper trails. Paper trails that you complain, you raise these concerns. You don't have to be ultra aggressive about it, because if you're not sure, probably better to question it. Questioning something and saying, it is this is very different. Saying, listen, I think this may be what I'm going through. I don't know, but this is how I'm experiencing it. This is what I'm experiencing. And I don't know if it has something to do with one of the specific protected characteristics, such as race. Maybe it has something to do with my race. Maybe it has something to do with my sexual orientation. Maybe it has to do with my national origin. I'm starting to notice you're treating somebody without an accent much better. My accent, Hispanic accent, you're not like you always say that I have communication issues. Why just me? Is it because of my accent? Whoa, I happen to be from the LGBTQ community. I present in a certain way. And as I present myself, you start to say that that's not very masculine of you, or that's not very feminine of you, right? Where are these stereotypes? How are they playing into how they treat you is something that you need to hold accountable. Because once you start to notice the little patterns, that's when you got to call it out, but you got to do it in a legally protected way, so that way you can avoid yourself from being retaliated against because you don't have any evidence of why you complained in the first place. Now, obviously, listen, I want to make sure this is very clear. And I have to say this. Every situation is unique. Everything is going to be dependent on you discussing it with an attorney that you speak with. So don't take this information and start being like, oh, Mahir Nisar told me to do this, so I did it, and that was legal advice. No, none of this is legal advice. This is just giving you patterns of behavior and things and tips and tools that you can think about using after you speak with an employment lawyer within your state, so that way you can address these situations.
So much of what you've just mentioned has resonated with people in the chat. I see people are affirming that when you're talking about this lack of sleep, and also saying that lack of sleep is connected to stage 1 hypertension. People are saying that they are getting all the feelings from what you're sharing here, and acknowledging what you mentioned, that it's not you, it's them. Amen, is what I'm seeing here in the chat. And I just want to take a moment for folks who have lived experience with workplace abuse, especially recent workplace abuse. If you start to notice that your heart starts to pound, that you're starting to sweat while you're sitting here, that your mind is kind of going off into another area, if you notice these might be indicators that your trauma is being activated here. And a couple of quick things that you can do to help yourself to regulate your nervous system. Moving back and forth repeatedly actually is something that activates the vagus nerve and helps to calm those stress hormones and elevate feel-good hormones. Also, getting a bag of frozen peas or something cold and putting it on the back of your neck underneath the base of the skull, that also activates that vagus nerve. Humming, especially if you put your fingers in your ears for just a second to amplify the vibration. All of those things are quick fixes. But if you find that you're feeling super distressed, you can log off of this, come back to the recording later as well. So I do want to make sure that people are as safe as possible while we're talking about this, because it can activate all sorts of really complex feelings for us. Going back to what you were sharing here about, trusting in our own gut reaction that, ooh, something's not right here, and the importance of keeping a paper trail. One of my favorite examples of this is what Ms. Jackie Abram talks about in Hush Money, which is a brilliant series that she's written on this topic about how one woman fought systemic racism and kept her job. And she talked about sending an email or documenting it in some way, the good stuff as well as the bad stuff. So if, I'm just in a meeting and somebody is repeatedly talking over me, and it's so obvious that I am being engaged in a different way than everyone else in the room, I would go back to my desk and I would just shoot off a quick email to somebody. It could be the person who was facilitating the meeting and just say, I was just in this meeting with you. I'm noticing that this is what was just happening here. Is there some other, and just documenting it in some way or another. So then you have a timestamp that the thing just happened. But I've also heard about people keeping a side note of, the date, the time, and who was a witness to what just happened. So if you don't want to escalate the energy in interpersonal dynamics, keeping a record for yourself can also be very, very helpful. Are there other suggestions that you have, sir, about how to kind of keep that detailed record?
Yeah, I think, paper trails are the most effective, right? And I think paper trails are, in essence, a mechanism of you reporting, objecting, questioning your experiences with your employer. Now, when I say making a paper trail, it's not really to make contemporaneous notes of what you're experiencing with the date, time, etc. That is also helpful, so that way you have a recollection of things that are patterns that you're recognizing, so that way down the road you're able to express it if in the event that you want to hold back before you raise the concern. Because ultimately, the more that you have in terms of explaining your experience is going to be more credible, because it's going to demonstrate that this is just not off of one particular thing. There are multitudes of things that have led up to you coming to this point to say, this doesn't feel good and it's happening way too often. One thing can also rise to that level. One statement, one microaggression, one slip that says something about, whether or not you should be treated this way versus that way, something that's condescending. Those type of things can be very indicative, right? And we see this, people being objectified based upon their looks, people being told that, you're like this, that's the way that you are, or that this is the type of food. Like, there's so many different examples of people trying to minimize individuals to certain characteristics that they have learned through popular culture, through the movies, through the mainstream media, right? And through our politicians that try to dehumanize people into saying that, this is how they are, right? And so we see this often, and we experience this day in and day out by those people that absorb this information. So when we're developing a paper trail, when we're complaining to our employer, or we're objecting or reporting it, it's about making sure that, number one, we do it in an email fashion. We do it in an email to your HR, because HR is the protocol that has been established by the company. Most companies have HR, and most of them are always going to protect the company. That's their job. They're meant to protect the company. Yes, there'll be some advocates, but primarily they're going to be out to protect the company. That being said, you want to specify clearly in your complaints what is the unlawful type of treatment that you're going through. That way it becomes protected against retaliation, and you want to keep copies of it. A lot of people often say that I did an email, but I lost it. They shut me out of my emails once they fired me. I don't have a copy of it, but I did complain. And unfortunately, a lot of lawyers are not going to be able to help you in that situation if you don't have the evidence in your possession. So it's really important that when you're building up a paper trail, that you recognize that you are building up evidence that you got to keep in the event that they actually go against you and try to shut you up by getting rid of you. Because that's what a lot of these employers do. They don't like troublemakers. They don't like people that are inconvenient to them. They cause inconvenience because it impacts their environment, even though they're the ones that are creating that environment that's harming you. And so they don't want anything to change. They want to keep the status quo. And so it's important that when you're looking to get a fair shot, when you're looking to get an equal opportunity, that you stand your ground. You have a right to be there. You have a right to be there. You have a legal right to be given a fair shot. They can't deny that to you just because you're not willing to accept their abuse, just because you don't have to take it. Why should you have to take it? They pay you a lot of money. Well, I hear this a lot of times. Oh, they pay me the good bucks, I'll stay quiet. That's going to hurt you down the road. That's going to hurt you. That money is going to be worth nothing when your health is suffering. It's never going to be. Nothing is ever going to be more valuable than your health. And so workplaces should not be causing you sickness. They should be healing you and building you up in your skill set and growing you so that you have a life of meaning and purpose, so that you can enjoy the time with your family and not be so worried about your job and the people that are there within your workplace that are causing you the harm. You shouldn't have to live in that way.
I appreciate that so much. I think it's Dr. Kamani Norrington Sands who has said something along the lines of, if you're using your health benefits to deal with the emotional or physical stress from your toxic job, it's not a good job, right? We shouldn't have to be using our health benefits or our sick leave or our vacation leave to deal with the trauma that we're experiencing at work. And I really appreciate what you're talking about also, that the health outcomes, the injuries that we sustain, both physiological and psychological, can last a lifetime. And so the longer that we stay in an abusive environment, the more that our bodies are flooded by those stress hormones, the more likely that we're going to have metabolic illnesses. As the person mentioned in the chat, it's also diabetes. It's also heart disease. It's also being overweight, obesity. It's also cancer. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's so many different physical and mental health outcomes that anyone is going to end up with. And this happens to all human beings if we are experiencing that daily stress for too long. It was really helpful also that you made very clear that you have to it's best to specify the law that's been broken, and that it be in writing, because people can say, oh, you told me, you didn't tell me that. I don't remember that. So it has to be in writing. kind of breaking that down a little bit, because I think this is probably the most useful information for the audience based on your laws. So we're talking about state laws and federal laws. Can you talk a little bit about, for somebody who doesn't know about either, where are your recommendations of how they should educate themselves on those?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, throughout the United States, a lot of people say that we are at will or in a right to work state. No matter what state you're in, you have a right to be treated fairly and have an equal opportunity within that work environment. You cannot be denied something based upon a protected characteristics. So, for instance, your race, religion, national origin, a disability, sexual orientation, age. These are all different protected characteristics for which you cannot be treated differently. And they're not going to tell you that they're treating you differently because of this, but you're going to experience it. You're going to have to identify it. And once you start to recognize those patterns and you think like, you know what, this feels like this because I'm looking around, I'm the only one like this. And this is how I'm going through this. That's when you've got to specify it. So if it's based upon your national origin, it's based upon your accent, right? Accent is tied with your identity. It's about your national origin. It's a national origin form of discrimination. You got to say, listen, I don't know what it is, but this person, this supervisor, doesn't like talking to me. Every time I speak with them, they correct the way that I say the words. They understand what I'm saying, or they'll say, I don't understand what you're saying. They'll put you down like that. They'll say it in such a way where your accent is an inconvenience to them. It's like almost a problem because in some way, they don't like that you're there. They have other prejudices that exist that maybe they think that you've taken somebody else's job. Whatever the situation may be, they have a thought process and they're going to be playing it out. They're not going to say it, but you're going to feel it from the way that they're going to act. And that's when you got to be like, listen, I don't know what it is, but every time I come in, they say these things to me. And I think it has to do with my accent, my national origin. They're treating me this way. And these are the different events of what I experienced. I'd like you to look into this because I really feel not only is it impacting me, but I can't do my job like this. How can I work with somebody that's treating me this way? And I think that's really what it comes down to, whether it's on your national origin, your race, your sexual orientation, your gender, whatever it may be. These are factors that you have to specify because when you say these key words, and it's so annoying because the reality is that the court process, if you have to end up in the court process, the judges, everything is in writing. Everything is written down. Paper, everything is paper. So that paper trail is saying, you know what, take that paper trail, go to court. But when the employer knows that you can go to court because you have evidence, they're not going to want you to go to court. And that's what empowers you. And I think it's important to understand that all these illnesses that we go through because of these stressful, harmful experiences, in many ways are as a result of not holding these places accountable. When we actually feel accountability within our core, that we have empowered ourselves to say, enough, this is what's happening, I need it to be looked into, and you get them to answer the questions. I don't know what it is. You can speak on this, but I think accountability makes people feel better. I believe it heals people. It doesn't solve all the problems. It's not going to heal every single aspect, but it makes you feel great to know that you stood up for yourself, you fought for your rights, and people were made to answer for what they made you experience. I think that is valuable.
100%. You're absolutely right. The research on the difference between stress and trauma has to do with the nervous system level of the fight, flight, and freeze response. When we are unable to defend against an aggressor, or when we are unable to escape an aggressor, when we get stuck, that's when stress turns into trauma. And so in any way to be able to speak truth to power is a completion of that response, that natural response that our bodies are already wired to do, which we end up getting thwarted if we don't have some recourse of speaking up for ourselves and establishing our boundaries. And I know from a lot of people, the thought of going to court is really scary. And they think about things like they don't have enough money to pay for an attorney. They're already at the end of their rope, as it were, of being able to just kind of manage through the day. And the thought of a really long, drawn out court case is very frightening. I have heard word on the street that 96% of potential lawsuits end up being settled outside of court with a former or current employer. And so they don't actually even get to court. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the reality of what happens. Like I'll tell people, if you have these questions, contact the National Employment Lawyers Association. Contact me, because you can find an attorney or go through several, interview the attorneys as well to find out whether or not you actually have a case. But could you talk a little bit more about the fears that tend to keep people from even taking that step? And what is the truth of the matter?
Absolutely. I think number one, first there's this misconception that employment lawyers are too expensive. Most employment lawyers do work on a contingency. They take a percentage if you have evidence. And this is why it's so important to understand how it's necessary to empower yourself with confronting these difficult circumstances, to stand up for yourself in those situations, which is why a lot of the tools that I provide are meant to make it easier, because in those moments when you are under the stress and the trauma of those experiences, it's not really easy to really operate at all, to even think about confronting a situation, to now be thinking about losing a job because, if I say something, they'll do this, because that's been nurtured in our culture. Our culture has nurtured us to stay silent in workplaces. That's what they want. You hear the whispers, oh, they said something, they're out. They got rid of them. This happens all the time. But you know what? You don't always hear about the success stories. You don't always hear about the people that settle their cases, because a lot of that's confidential. You don't hear about those moments where that employer was made to pay because of what they did. And because of that, people lost their job because they did what they did. And not only that, but people were made to answer. One thing that companies really value is money, right? Profits over people. We hear it all the time. And that's the one thing that they account for more than anything else. So when you make them pay it, they wonder when they sit down with their accountants, how did we lose this amount of money? Why did we have to pay this out? And then they go through a process of reflection and looking through what led to this, who did this, who was the person that contributed to this. We can't have that. This is a loss. And that's the game. The game is about empowering yourself to hold them accountable, to get them to pay for what they made you experience. Now, it's not going to be perfect. The legal system isn't perfect. It does not solve all the problems. It leaves you with a lot of loss in your health, in your time. But the goal of the money and the compensation is to try to win back that time as much as you possibly can. And so I think, you mentioned National Employment Lawyers Association, phenomenal organization. I'm a member of it. It is a employee-based organization, meaning that the attorneys that are there only represent employees, right? That's the main part of the mission and purpose of the organization, is to represent employees only. And so employment attorneys also represent management, employers, but they're not in NELA. NELA is for plaintiffs, people that are raising concerns based upon mistreatment within the workplace. And most attorneys, now it depends on different states like California, New York, New Jersey, you're going to find attorneys often in these places where they're going to be offering contingency-based representation. If you're a federal employee, it may not be as easy because the systems of the government and the process of holding the government accountable is not that easy. And so employers can't afford to do it. So that's when they might charge you something. But on other circumstances, or even public employees, if you work for the state or the city, in any state, it's a long, drawn-out process. And the more time that something takes, the more costly it becomes. Because at the end of the day, lawyers are actually trading their time, right? They're trading their time to provide you that service. And I think it's important. This is one of the reasons why empowering yourself can actually, having necessity to hire a lawyer can almost be eliminated, because if you have a paper trail that demonstrates that employer has done something wrong, right? That you're complaining about it, they are going to look at the risk that you expose them to right there and then to see whether or not they can address the situation to your benefit. It's not always going to happen, but I do see it happen where they actually are now compelled to be like, listen, if we don't fix this would cost us more, because maybe that person that you're complaining about has had previous complaints by somebody else that was there before you, right? They probably protected that person before, and now they're seeing a recurring pattern that, okay, now this has happened once, twice, 3 times. This person isn't good for us. We paid out before, we kept them. Now we're going to do it again. Maybe we got to get rid of this person, keep this person, and address the situation. So compelling employers to do the right thing does happen. And you may not even need a lawyer in that situation. So understanding the value of that paper trail, specifying the unlawful treatment clearly, the specific protected class is going to be essential.
Oh my gosh, this is amazing. I really, really appreciate your taking the time to share this kind of insight with us. And I'm seeing that it's really impacting people already in the chat. One LinkedIn user is asking, can you talk about severance payoffs and how does that relate to guilt, please?
So severance agreements are offers to settle your claims in many ways, right? Because severance agreements are money given to you, they're offers of money in exchange for you agreeing to waive your rights against that employer. So you may have legal claims against that employer that that employer has assessed. They want to make sure that before you leave, before they fire you, that they have, cleaned their hands of anything that potentially could happen. They don't want to have to deal with you later down the road. They don't want you to sue them. So they try to take control of the termination by offering severance payments. And those payments are meant to put you in a position where you've been told that, listen, unfortunately, we're having to lay you off, we're terminating you due to performance, or whatever the situation may be, but we're going to be very generous to you at this time because we understand you're going to be out. Here's 4 weeks of pay, and we hope you'll sign it by next week, whatever it may be. And in those situations, you haven't heard of anything, you haven't really been able to identify that what has happened here. You don't even know what hit you in that moment because now you're in shock. You just lost your livelihood, and you're being told that you're not going to have money coming in. So you're not thinking about a lot of things. It's traumatic. So in those moments, they're looking to take advantage by giving you sums of money in exchange for you agreeing to sign off on that agreement where you waive a lot of your legal rights. So it's important at that time to understand what is the value of what you're giving up. Okay, if you are being asked to give up something, what is the value of it? If it's worth $100,000, you should get $100,000. You need to understand this. This is why having an attorney on your side in that moment when you have been put through the situation is for you to evaluate, for that attorney to evaluate, okay, let's look at what led up to this. What happened? Did you say anything? Did you go on medical leave? Will you just come back from maternity leave? Did you speak up? Did you call out one of your supervisors that was saying something that was inappropriate? And now all of a sudden they're retaliating against you by doing this. And a lot of times employers are smart. They like to kind of create a distance between those activities and when they actually decide to terminate you. So you're going to have to go back and look and see what changed your experience. One day everything was good. The next day everything started to go downhill. That moment is when you got to look and speak with that lawyer and say, listen, this is what happened. All of a sudden, they've now structured my exit. They've offered me severance. What can I do? What are my options? At that point, your lawyer is going to talk to you about what are your options. The decision is always in the client's hand. The lawyer doesn't do anything unless the client agrees. So it's at that point you evaluate your options, and then you see, is there a way that you can negotiate that severance through that lawyer, right? Can you get more money? Can you enhance it? It's going to be a discussion about, what legal claims exist. You're asking me to waive my rights. What is the value of my rights that I'm giving up here? So those things have to be discussed. And when it comes to when you're talking about guilt, I think I can understand that there might be a sense of guilt in accepting something because of the circumstances of being without money coming in for a period and not really taking the time or really knowing and having the mental clarity in that moment to be like, okay, do I have any options? What other option do I have? Right? And maybe signing off on it is something that you do because in that moment, the financial stressor is so heavy that thinking about anything beyond it is not possible. So I think in that moment, I think it's important to understand that having an attorney on your side, an employment lawyer that understands the situation, and speaking to a few, you don't need to speak to one, speak to a few, and feel comfortable. Trust is an important aspect of any relationship. It should be no different when it comes to hiring an attorney. There are a lot of attorneys out there that are looking to make money. Nothing wrong with that. But when they prioritize money and they don't prioritize your interest, then it's not okay. And you need to recognize when you feel like it doesn't feel good. If it doesn't feel right without a lawyer, they're not going to advocate that great for you. So it's important for you to go through these steps when you're offered a severance or you're put in that position.
Wow, you're incredible. And so again, for anyone who's in New Jersey, New York, right? Those are the two states that you're licensed.
Yeah, we have attorneys that we work with in Ohio and North Carolina as well.
Oh, okay. Ohio and North Carolina as well. Okay. My hope is that you're phone will be off the hook ringing from people because, my gosh, I mean, the fact that you talk about this in a trauma-informed way is so incredibly important. You mentioned earlier that, you know, when you were kind of sideswiped by a sudden layoff, oftentimes our brains, the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain goes offline. And the amygdala, the alarm system, is running the show. And so literally it makes it difficult to process information. It makes it difficult to remember short-term things that have just happened recently. It can make it very difficult to articulate, especially really emotionally charged memories. And what can be really challenging for people who have just gone through that kind of workplace trauma is feeling like, I've got to make a decision right now, very quickly. And I think one of the common patterns that can happen with savvy employers is they're going to try and run out the clock on you. So they know that, you know, oh, they'll say things like, oh, we'll do an internal investigation, and it drags on forever, and meetings are canceled, and you're not getting responses to things, and maybe someone's going on vacation or whatever. And then suddenly, when it's time to contact an attorney, too much time might have passed to have the kind of leverage that one might need. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about timelines that people should be aware of, please.
Yeah, so I mean, you have a different timeline from depending on when you experience the harm. That is illegal, right? So under federal law, you have specific timelines that you have to be mindful of when you can file within the EEOC. But it all depends. I mean, I think it really depends on what your end goal is, what your objective is. You talk about EEOC, you have local state agencies within your state, you have your state court system, you have a lot of these different venues, and you have certain deadlines that you have to meet in order to file it. You may be a federal employee or a public employee. You may have certain statutory requirements where you have to exhaust before you can even pursue your claim. In any of these circumstances, when you are starting to notice that something is off, something is wrong, there's no harm in speaking with a lawyer that is going to offer you a free consultation. I mean, you know, obviously, you know, be mindful. I think I've seen it often. Sometimes, it becomes difficult. Lawyers are not therapists. Lawyers are not therapists. I know that, you know, it's important for lawyers to be empathetic and understand how challenging the situation is. But lawyers are not trained to be therapists or provide psychological treatment. And oftentimes, even though we may be aware or may be knowledgeable about how difficult these experiences are, we're not professionals in that area. We're professionals as lawyers, and we have to practice law. And so it's important to understand the distinction. And it's also important to know that when you're going to be reaching out to an attorney to seek a consultation, that you're mindful of the time that they're giving to you. It's free, right? They're giving you a free time to speak with them. And it's important for you to be prepared and be respectful and be kind. Even though you've gone through so much, you know, at the end of the day, it's a relationship. That attorney will feel for you, but doesn't want to feel bad as a result of speaking with you, right? I oftentimes see people that I can't help because they're just going through such a hard time. And I'm a human being too. I deal with my own traumas. So
Sure.
I think, you know, at the end of the day, I have to take care of myself, and I encourage people to take care of themselves as well. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that every relationship that you are going to enter into has to be one in which you trust the person. You feel like the communication is clear and there's understanding, there's respect, mutual respect. And so that's the same with the attorney-client relationship. So I think, you know, in terms of, you know, reaching out to a lawyer, be prepared to discuss the specific things that have happened to you and be willing to listen and be asked questions and provide answers. Yeah, I think, did I answer your question? I think I did.
You did, and so much more. I mean, you're amazing. You're like the amazing guest. You're like, I asked one question, we get the answer to five. Yeah, no. That really was. I'm being completely honest with you. That's phenomenal. One of the things that many of us might feel, especially from communities of color where there's intergenerational racialized labor trauma, is the fear that if I go to HR, I will be retaliated against. And I'm wondering if my own kind of trauma brain is making me be too conservative in this one area. I always tell people, when you are going to file a complaint or notify HR, it's a good idea to think about worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is they are immediately going to push back, retaliate against you, monitor your email, take your computer, whatever it might be. So it's a good idea to have a go bag. And go bags are things that we tend to think about for, fleeing domestic violence or fleeing, if there's a wildfire or something. But I actually think it's actually not a bad metaphor for the workplace because of the abusive dynamics that can happen in the workplace. So I'll tell people what are the things to put in that go bag. One would be your annual performance evaluations. All of the documentation that you mentioned about incidences of reporting things that have happened that have gone wrong, but also documentation of the things that you've done really well. Because oftentimes the people who are targeted vis-a-vis research out of the Workplace Bullying Institute is that we tend to be really smart, really competent. We tend to have subject matter expertise and get along well and refuse to engage in politics. And we've got this imposter leader who is, threatened by us. And so oftentimes there will be some documentation. It might be from a lateral or it might be from people on another team about the places where we're really successful. So having those things plus the employee handbook and then your job offer letter. Is there anything else that you would recommend somebody have already in a toxic job go bag, as it were, in case they suddenly lose access to their computers?
Okay, so this is great that you raised this. I think it's important. The first thing I will say, and I really want you to understand this, don't go to HR.
Okay.
Don't go to HR. If you think that you're going to be able to control the conversation by raising concerns, by going to them in person or getting on the phone with them, that's going to be a major risk factor. And yes, then that go bag needs to be really prepared well, which is why I feel like you shouldn't even need to go back. This is why that paper trail is essential. When you complain or you're concerned or you're questioning what you're going through, that's the time when you complain in writing through email to your HR. If you have that conversation in person, memorialize it in an email and make sure you specify that unlawful treatment, because that's what makes it protected against retaliation. When that employer knows that by engaging in retaliation against you, by terminating you, by demoting you, by reducing your hours, by making things worse for you in that environment because you complain, that they're creating a legal claim, regardless of whether or not you actually experienced discrimination in the first place, it is powerful. And they know that. That's why they'll often say, why don't we have this conversation over Zoom? Don't send us an email. Don't send us an email. Why don't we talk on the phone? Why don't we sit down together? Let's make it personal, right? And a lot of these people will be prepared to really be able to manage the circumstances which poses a risk to them, not what benefits you and protects you and caters to safety for you. If they actually cared about that, do you think that you would have had to even have to raise the concern in the first place? They would have been on top of it. They're controlling that environment. They're nurturing that environment. If that environment is hurting you, where are they? How are they allowing it to happen? And I think that once you recognize that there is that discrimination, harassment that's illegal that's happening, if by you staying silent, it's not going to get better. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but there's no career progression that you're going to have if they are treating you in that way. So your worst case scenario by you raising this concern in writing is that what are you truly giving up? Because all that's there is you're being mistreated, you're being abused, you're getting hurt, you're being denied. And by you not speaking up, you're just experiencing more of it. And now you're building up the muscle of taking it and expecting it and almost just like living with that experience. But when you are going to hold it accountable and you're going to challenge those systems in a protected way, a legally protected way, it empowers you and it levels the playing field that they now have to see you where you're at. And when they have to see you where you're at, they have to recognize that, okay, how do we address this situation? Do we, what you mentioned, they go through an investigation. We're going to take your complaint seriously and we're going to investigate this. And they may go through a process where they're once again going to build a record to protect the company. Don't take it upon yourself to think that by them investigating themselves, that they're somehow going to police themselves and hold themselves accountable. It doesn't happen like that. But it's a process of building that record and that paper trail. And it's at that point when you're going through these things, getting a lawyer involved to guide you, advise you, and a mental health professional. I can't stress this enough. A mental health professional to deal with these circumstances is so important, because these places are hoping that you will leave. They're hoping that you'll just walk out the door on your own. That because they're not addressing your situation, because when they're not holding your situation accountable, that they're hoping that that door that you see in that exit sign is something that appeals to you. So that, you know what, when you resign from a position voluntarily, it waives a lot of your legal rights to hold them accountable. So that's why they often say, rather than terminating you, we'll give you the option. You can just voluntarily resign. And that way you'll feel like you saved face. That's what they'll try to project it as. It's not what it is. They're not there to help you. They're never going to help you. They're there to protect themselves. That person that's doing their job knows what their job is, to protect the company. So I think that if you're in that situation, I think that even if you're complaining about, the workplace discrimination, harassment you're doing in that paper trail, having those records of your complaints is essential. Having evidence. Now, different states have different laws with respect to recording, right? You might be able to record in your state. Some two-party states you can't record without consent of the other party. In one-party states you can. And if you can't really catch somebody in a lie or in a mistreatment or an abusive situation, sometimes recordings can be the thing that sets things apart. You see that in today's society, that unless we see it visually, that somebody is experiencing brutality because of their skin color, and it's not right, it's like the whole world doesn't believe it's happening. Even when you see it happening, you don't even get justice. So it's harder for us in that environment that is trying to control the truth. So that's why it's important for you to build up that evidence and have the things necessary. And one of the things you mentioned was performance. A lot of employers will try to use your performance as the basis to terminate you. They'll try to say you're not meeting expectations, you're not a good cultural fit. They'll give you all these common things to say why you're not good there, right? And so, yes, that's going to be a legitimate business reason to get rid of you. And so having records that actually show that that's not true is going to be helpful. And I've seen this happen. 3 months before I got a raise, 3 months later, they fired me for performance. I've been there for 20 years. All of a sudden, they say I can't do my job, right? What kind of nonsense is that? So there's a lot of these weird situations because they don't know what to say. They're just trying to put a label on it. So that way you're like, oh, time for me to go, right? But you can hold them accountable for what they do when it's wrong. And I think it's important to be prepared for that and have the evidence and proof that you need. So that way you can hold them accountable under law.
Excellent feedback. Thank you so much from this. And I'm seeing some more comments here. Lucy Kosam has said, wow, that hits hard. So people are really resonating. The reframe conversation away from having to defend your reputation or record. I think that for so many of us, especially who might be like first people in our family to go to college or to enter into a white collar workplace, perhaps our parents or grandparents worked in factories or in agricultural fields or other places, we may not have ever been around people who know what the culture is like in workplaces. So we don't know that when that HR person who's super friendly to us and says all the things that make it sound like they really are interested in our best interests, it's actually an underhanded way to get us just to waltz out the door, as you had said, through a constructive discharge, because we're easier for them in that way. It makes me think about your other comment of how our brains just work differently when we're in these high levels of stress. And so the recommendation might be, don't sign anything. Just don't sign anything until you are able to show it to an attorney. And if you're over 40 years old, you have even more time to make decisions about things, oftentimes than other people do. So there's no reason to have to sign something immediately. It's never going to be in your best interest.
Never. You're absolutely right. A lot of times you may feel the pressure to do something right away because they want you to do it right away. And oftentimes what they want is not always in your interest. It's often not in your interest, right? If they truly care about you, then they're gonna give you the right fair amount of time to really consider what they're offering you or what they're having you sign. Why would anybody make you sign something that you don't understand? Then they don't want you to understand, right? They just want you to sign it. So it's oftentimes that we see that. because they don't really want you to know what's going on. Because if they were transparent about what exists and what's happening, then they would themselves never allow it to occur in the first place. So I think it's important to make sure that you at least understand what's at play, even if you don't have a lawyer, because maybe, whatever the circumstances may be, maybe in your specific state, maybe attorneys do charge money because then maybe you're in Alabama or something and the workplace rights aren't that good, or like places like Florida or Texas. I mean, I know attorneys that do offer free consultation in those places, but there's a lot that don't. And so you may not find that one, even though it may be there. Maybe they may not return phone calls. I hear this a lot too. So it's not easy, but taking the time that you need to make the decisions that are going to impact your life is always worth taking time. Always worth taking time. Take your time, speak with professionals, speak with mental health professionals, gain clarity, speak with lawyers, understand the legal consequences of what you're having to agree to, and ultimately talk to your family members because they spend time with you and it's important. I think it's important. I think one of the things you mentioned that I think um, a lot of people that come from as immigrant families that come into the United States and they grow up here and go through the school system and the first generation that's going into the workforce and they're going into a work environment where they're going to be having to go through these real world experiences. We don't know like what is to be expected. A lot of times we have been taught to be grateful for what we have earned and not question authority because that's how we've protected ourselves. That's how the generation before us protected themselves and us, is by staying under the radar, staying quiet and subservient and just be grateful for whatever they give. But that's not how it works. It should never work that way. You have a right. You have a right to grow. You have a right to earn a lot of money for the services that you provide and skills that you have. And you should not be denied a right to grow because of who you are or because they think they don't want you there. That's not their choice. They don't make that decision. If they're going to be working, they're going to be running a business in the United States, they're going to have to follow the law because that law is for all of us. It's meant to protect all of us. And I think we have to take ownership of that as minority, the people that are from the global majority. We have to take ownership of who we are, be proud of who we are, and fight for those rights when they're being trampled upon. Because nobody else is going to do it. I know that, relying on a lawyer is great, but they can only advocate for you. But they're advocating for what you did. What did you do? And I know it's hard in those situations. But getting help is just one phone call away. So you got to make those phone calls. You got to talk to people that will help you. And if you're not prepared to speak with a lawyer right away, speak with a mental professional so that way you can be in the right state of mind to have that conversation. Take medical leave. If you're going through the trauma, get FMLA after 1 year. If your qualifying employer offers FMLA, you have to take that. Take that time off. Take short-term disability. Take an accommodation. Speak with a health professional. Get the time that you need in order to understand when you feel it in your body that it's not okay. If it's not okay, it doesn't feel right, gain clarity on what your options are because it shouldn't be that way.
Wow. Oh my gosh. I have so many questions for you, and you have been so gracious to log on in East Coast Standard Time. So I want to acknowledge that we are at the end of the hour here. This was truly amazing. I am so grateful to you, and I'm grateful to the audience who have been putting comments and questions in the chat. I'm going to drop into the chat a couple of follow-up links. So I'll drop in your contact information, your handles for social media so people can reach out to you. Also, there is a line for a confidential conversation with people to get some ideas about workplace rights. So it's not an attorney, but it is just if you have questions about things like how to take FMLA, family medical leave, or what are your rights around, the time to sign a severance agreement or what have you, you can ask some of those questions. And then also to recommend for people, if you're in a big city and there's a law school nearby, a number of law schools, I live near Stanford, and they have a law clinic in the community that has really phenomenal, bright people who are there to help at free or reduced costs. So there are additional ways to get needs met. Is there any final comment that you'd like to leave us with, sir?
No, I mean, I think, I hope that this has been helpful. I think I really appreciate you also organizing this and kind of providing your expertise in the conversation and leading it with prioritizing mental health and really inclusivity for our overall communities from the BIPOC and LGBTQ plus community. I think it's important that we talk about these experiences and empower each other so that way, we're treated fairly and we have an opportunity to have success in our life. I don't think that anybody should be denied that. And when it is denied, we got to empower ourselves to hold it accountable because nobody should be able to get away with it.
I want to thank not only you for this conversation, but also, frankly, to your parents, to your grandparents, to any educators, whomever it was along the way that made you the kind of man who would speak up and advocate for people and encourage people to advocate for themselves. That comes through so powerfully. And if no one has told you recently, you are a gem, sir, and we are most fortunate to have you in this role. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everyone who's logged in. I hope everyone has a great evening. Take good care.